This summer, we get to watch the Olympics in Paris. Anyone else excited about the Olympics? I love the Olympics. I'm a really big fan of the swimming and the volleyball, but my favorite event to watch in the Olympics is USA basketball. The United States invented basketball, so we've always kind of had the upper hand there, but up until 1992, did you know there was a rule in place that NBA players were not allowed to play in the Olympics? So we, along with every other country, fielded our best college players, and sometimes we won, and sometimes we didn't. But finally, the rule was changed, and I'm sure you remember what happened in the 1992 Olympics. The U.S. put together what was known as the Dream Team. Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Charles Barkley, and on and on. It was the greatest basketball team ever assembled, and they won every single game by an average of 44 points. After that year, the rest of the world began to catch up in basketball. You fast forward to 2004, and the U.S. only won bronze. That was unacceptable, and it led to my generation's Dream Team, otherwise known as the Redeem Team, in 2008. That was LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade, and they won the gold once again for the U.S. I'm excited because this year, the U.S. is again fielding its best possible lineup of players. We've got guys like LeBron and Curry and Durant and Embiid and all these great players. We're going to have our all-stars on the court. And that's what you would expect in an event like the Olympics. When you're building a team, of course, you want the best players on your team. That's true in sports. That's true on your team at work or any other team that you'd be a part of. You want people with the right abilities and the right cohesion. That just makes sense. Well, this morning, we're going to look at the team Jesus picked to lead his new movement called the church. And of course, being Jesus, God in flesh, he assembled the best team ever, right? I mean, he had the most important message in the history of the world that he needed to get out to literally every single person on the planet. So he picked the best and the brightest he could find, right? He assembled the Christian Avengers, right? No, not exactly. Instead of the all-star team, Jesus put together a team we're affectionately calling this morning the no-star team. You know them as the 12 disciples. Who were these guys? Where did they come from? And how did they get to be the ones that Jesus would use to change the world forever? That's what I want to show you. So let's look at our text today in Luke 6, and let's see the moment where Jesus picked out by hand those who would become his leaders. Luke 6, look at verses 12 through 16. In these days, he, that's Jesus, went out to the mountain to pray. And all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, who he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Let's take a moment before digging in to kind of remember where we've been. We just finished up a 6-week break from Luke, finishing or walking through book of the Bible, 2 Peter. So it's been a minute, but if you remember back before Easter, we walked through the start of Jesus' ministry. He had the miraculous birth, then he had those years of obscurity, then John the Baptist came on the scene and got everybody excited, then Jesus came out and he was teaching and healing and casting out demons, and he started to make some noise. And with that, people began to choose sides. There were the Pharisees on one side, the religious elite, who chose to oppose Jesus. They thought he was out of bounds. He ate with sinners. He broke their man-made rules. So they were against him. But then there were others who were for him on the other side, people who were beginning to leave everything else to follow him around from place to place, men and women who were sold out to the cause of Jesus. So Jesus knew that he needed to organize his followers. He needed some structure, some leadership, because he had this plan to change the world forever. But before he selected the 12 who would lead the group, what did Jesus do? Look at it again. Don't miss this. He prayed. And he didn't just pray, he prayed all night. Let's just sit on this for a minute before we get into the 12 disciples. This is so significant. Why did Jesus pray so long and so intensely before this moment? And why did he even need to pray at all? Think about it. Jesus is God, right? Why would God need to pray, which is talking to God? Well, first off, it's actually because Jesus is God that he prayed. You see, God is one God in three persons. Jesus is God the Son, and he has a very tight, eternal relationship with God the Father and God the Spirit. And a part of that relationship, like any other relationship, is communicating with one another. So Jesus has been talking with his Father for all eternity past. So of course he continued that when he was on the earth. But the other reason Jesus prayed is because he is human. When Jesus came to the earth, he took on flesh and became fully man like us. He had a full human experience, which included being dependent on God. He says often in the Gospels that he does what his Father tells him to do. So as a human being like you and me, he sought God in his direction through prayer. And Luke, especially in his gospel, is going to keep pointing out the prayer life of Jesus, because prayer is one of the things Jesus did more than anything else. Talking to his Father, spending time in fellowship with him was essential to his mission. So the obvious takeaway for us then is, don't you think if Jesus prayed, we should pray too? I think so. I think we've got to pray to survive this life. We have got to spend time with our Heavenly Father if we're going to survive this Christian life. And in Jesus, he gives us the pattern to follow right here. Why then do we see that Jesus prayed all night before selecting the 12? A couple of hours could have sufficed, right? Did he really need to go all night? That kind of tells us the significance of this moment. That this was a major step in Jesus' plan to save the world. He was about to select the men who he would pour the last years of his life into, the men who he would leave behind to ensure that his message and his church would be spread around the globe. So let's look now at how he determined who those men would be. Look again at verse 13. It says, and when day came, he, Jesus, called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. One thing we might miss is that Jesus chose the 12 from a larger pool of disciples. It wasn't like these were the only guys he had to work with or the only ones who would give him the time of day. No, that wasn't the case. We don't know the exact number of disciples Jesus had at this point, but we'll see throughout the gospel several times where large groups of men and women follow him around. And it's from this larger group that he then picks the 12. So that means each of these guys was carefully selected. They were chosen with intention. They were the ones Jesus wanted to lead. Once he had chosen the 12, we see that Jesus gave them this title, the title apostle. And that word is different from disciple. Disciple means student or learner. The word apostle means one who is sent. The idea is that these men were given a special authority to represent Jesus and to be sent out on his behalf. In the early church, the apostles held a unique office. Along with the apostle Paul, they had been personally commissioned by Jesus, and when they died, the office of apostle went with them. That's why we don't use that title of apostle in the church today. There's also significance we need to see in the number 12. Jesus was a Jewish man, and the 12 were all Jewish men too. So they would have looked around at the number that Jesus selected, and they would have really connected that to what? To the 12 tribes of Israel. These men were not replacing the 12 tribes, but they were clearly going to function in a similar way. Just as Israel had 12 representatives, the church would have 12 representatives to get it started. And we see in Revelation 21 that both of those groups, the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles, both have their names written on the heavenly city called the New Jerusalem. So that's important. This moment then, where Jesus selects the 12 and names them apostles, is a big moment. This is a huge step in his plan of redemption, which makes it all the more amazing to see how and who he chose. First, let me explain the uniqueness in how Jesus chose the 12 apostles. In the first century Jewish world, teachers of the law were called rabbis. And we see Jesus referred to as a rabbi several times in the Gospels. And Jesus was not the only rabbi to have disciples. That was a typical part of being a rabbi. You invested your knowledge into young men to pass it on. However, a Jewish rabbi in this time would not ordinarily call his own disciples. Rather, the disciples would come to him wanting to learn. And when a disciple committed to follow that rabbi, they were committing to follow the Torah. That was the law. And this commitment was understood to be a temporary one. They would be trained in hopes of one day eventually becoming their own rabbi. But we see that Jesus did things differently. Jesus didn't wait for his disciples to come to him. He sought them out and chose his own. And he didn't call them necessarily to follow the Torah. He called them ultimately to follow him. And that call wasn't temporary, but it was understood. He said, take up your cross, that they would follow him to their deaths. While what Jesus was doing here was not unique in Jewish culture, how he did it was very unique. He was clearly separating himself from the other rabbis of his day to prove that he was the Messiah. But even more unique than how Jesus called his disciples was who he called. And that's where I want to spend the rest of our time today. I want to walk through the 12 apostles and share with you two surprising qualities they display. Here's the first surprising quality that we see. Number one, we see that Jesus calls the unlikely. The unlikely. Let's think back again to that 1992 Dream Team. If you had been given the task of building a basketball team that would win the gold medal in the 1992 Olympics, you would have likely chosen the exact same team. Even if you know nothing about basketball, you could have built that team. The goal of basketball is to score more points than your opponent. So, of course, you'd pick the players who were the best scorers in the game. You'd also look at who were the best defenders to prevent the other team from scoring. That's common sense. And that's exactly why guys like Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley were stars on that team. So now consider you're a Jewish rabbi looking to pass on the Jewish faith and to build up your religious community. You'd probably want disciples who were of a certain caliber of student, who had a greater knowledge and interest in the Torah than others their age, who guys who were well respected and who others looked up to. You'd want guys who were particularly gifted at teaching. You'd want guys who were loyal and committed. Again, that just makes common sense. So is that the kind of guys Jesus picked to be his disciples? Better yet, is that the kind of guys Jesus picked to be the leaders of his disciples, the apostles? We already said no. Here's how Pastor John MacArthur described the group in the introduction of his book, 12 Ordinary Men. He says it like this: they were perfectly ordinary men in every way. Not one of them was renowned for scholarship or great erudition. They had no track record as orators or theologians. In fact, they were outsiders as far as the religious establishment of Jesus' day was concerned. They were not outstanding because of any natural talents or intellectual abilities. On the contrary, they were all too prone to mistakes, misstatements, wrong attitudes, lapses of faith, and bitter failure. No one more so than the leader of the group, Peter. Even Jesus remarked that they were slow learners and somewhat spiritually dense. That's a great summary of this group. They were ordinary, unlikely selections for any rabbi, much less the most important leader in the history of the world. So who were they? Well, let's look again at the 12 names listed. Verse 14. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John. Pause right there. We know there's some significance to the order of the names because every time they're listed in the New Testament, Peter always comes first. We've already learned some about Peter, also called Simon, in the first 6 chapters of Luke. Remember, Jesus healed his mother-in-law, then he helped him to haul in the biggest catch of his life, and then he called him to go out and to fish for men. And Peter left his boats behind to become the leader of the disciples. That's why his name is first. He's the top dog. And sometimes his leadership was really well done. Peter walked on water. He was the first to make the big confession that Jesus is the Christ. But other times, having Peter in first place was really unfortunate. Peter often spoke before thinking. He could be impulsive, or as we say in the South, he could be a little too big for his britches. The next 3 names after Peter are the same in every list, just in different orders. You've got Andrew, who is Peter's brother, and then another set of brothers, James and John. James and John, along with Peter, formed Jesus' inner circle. They would often get to play a bigger role in his ministry than the others. They were present for some of his greatest works, including what we saw in 2 Peter, the transfiguration, when Peter talked about that. All 4 of these guys, though, were fishermen and business partners, and they had likely known one another for many years growing up in Galilee together. Fishing in the first century was not a sport, as it is today often. It was a job, and a very common one at that. Fishermen worked at night. They spent a lot of time out on the water, and they smelled like dead fish. So you can imagine that they were not very influential people in their day. When it came to religious activity, by all indications, they were faithful men of God, but clearly they were not star students. We know that because all Jewish boys learned the Torah growing up. And those who excelled remained students into their teenage years, and those who didn't, well, they went to do the family job. By all indications, these 12 apostles were a part of the group that didn't make the cut. They weren't bad guys or anything like that, but in the Jewish system, you had religious classes, and they were at the bottom of the totem pole, while guys like Pharisees and priests were at the top. So here's the big question for us then. Why? Why did Jesus willingly choose? Out of all the people he could have picked, why did he choose this group? Why did he go for the ordinary and the unlikely? Man, there's so much we could say here about this. But I just want to keep it simple this morning and give you one big reason. Jesus used the unlikely to prove that he can use us too. This really is the story of the whole Bible. From Abraham on down to Moses, to David, to Esther, to the prophets, to Mary Magdalene. God seeks out people who the world looks at and says, no way, not them. They're disqualified. They're last round picks. They're not all stars, they're no stars. And God says, that's exactly then who I want. And he demonstrates his power and his grace by using the unlikely. I believe this is a message that all of us need to hear. Because we've all got a million excuses for why we are unlikely to be used by God or to make a difference for him. Let me just give you 3 excuses that we give most often for why God is unlikely to use someone like me. And let me show you then why they're all bunk. Here's the first excuse we give. First one is this: I'm not smart enough. I just don't know enough. I don't know all the Bible answers, or I don't know enough about other religions or culture. I'm not a pastor or a teacher or a leader. If you've ever struggled with that thought, consider the fishermen. Jesus was not looking for the religious scholars of his day or the priests or the scribes. If he was looking for people with a lot of spiritual knowledge, that's who he would have picked. But he didn't. He chose fishermen. I'm not saying the fishermen were dumb, but they weren't the ones people were going to for spiritual counsel. They weren't the ones out teaching in the synagogues. But these guys knew one thing, and that was enough. They knew Jesus. We see this simple qualification in other places in the Gospels. For example, in the Gospel of John, there's a story about a blind man who's healed by Jesus. And he goes in the city and people see him and they're asking him all these questions. Man, who healed you and how did he do it? And what did he say? Who is this guy? And the guy, he says, look, I don't know. All I know is I was blind and now I see. That was his testimony and it's still being shared today. Think also about the woman at the well. She meets Jesus at the well. She runs back to her town and she says this. She says, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Well, what do you know about the doctrine of the Trinity? Can you explain that first? Or can you explain justification by grace through faith for me? No, she didn't know all the answers. She didn't have it all figured out. She just said, just come and see. Just come and see. That's it. Look, if you know Jesus, then you know enough to be used by him to make a difference for his kingdom. Here's the second excuse we give. I'm not cool enough. When I started doing student ministry, I was a college kid, and I thought one of the keys to being effective in ministry was being cool. I needed to attract people to me and be flashy and exciting. I had to be hip and happening. But you know what I found out? I found out that the most faithful, godly people in my church were not very cool. And that's not an insult. They didn't care. They weren't trying to be impressive and relevant. Some of them were downright socially awkward. That did not stop them because they were more concerned with being faithful than fitting in. I found out the hard way. I'm not cool. Now I have kids to remind me of that. And the more I try to be cool, guess what? The less cool I become. A lot of times I am downright lame. So you know what? Amen. I'm just going to be lame for Jesus. I'm okay with that. Look, flash and bang, trendy and hip is way overrated. You don't have to be a buzzing entrepreneur, a marketing guru, or a motivational speaker to be used by God. You don't even need to be an extrovert. Are you shy? Do you get nervous around people? Are you terrified that the pastor is going to ask everyone to stand up and shake hands with the folks around them? If that's you, welcome to the club. You can be used by Jesus. Here's the third excuse we give, and this is the biggest one. I'm not good enough. I got things in my past that I'm ashamed of, that I hide. I've done things and said things. I got baggage. You know what? I'm still working on myself today. I still struggle with sin. I don't always read my Bible and pray like I'm supposed to. I need to work on myself before I could possibly help someone else. If that's you, if you wait until you're good to make a difference in someone's life, you will be waiting till heaven. And by then it's too late. None of us are good. All of us at some level are hypocrites. I'm not saying we shouldn't be repenting of sin in our lives and pursuing godliness, but I'm saying a sinful past and even sinful struggles in the present do not disqualify you from being used by God. I know people who have done some of the worst things who have been used by God to do some of the best things. I know people who before Jesus served time in prison, were addicted to drugs, hurt people, lied, cheated, attacked Christians, had an abortion, lived a homosexual lifestyle, or swore that they would never become one of those idiotic Christians. And yet Jesus found them. And they were saved and changed. And now they're being used by him. I say all that to say, your past does not disqualify you, but when you give it all to Jesus, it becomes a testimony of his grace. So being smart enough, cool enough, or good enough is not what's required to be used by Jesus. Then what is it? It's simply this. You just have to be willing. That's what we see with these fishermen. They were willing to follow and leave everything behind and go wherever Jesus sent them. Jesus called the unlikely, and he still calls them today. Every excuse you have, every strike against you, it actually makes you more likely to be used by God because God loves a challenge. He loves to display his glory through inglorious situations, and he loves to do the unlikely with unlikely people. Now, the rest of the apostles, after the first four, we know a lot less about. We see them in the Gospels do and say some particular things, and we have some extra biblical history about what they might have went on to do. But we actually know very little about their professions or their personalities. However, there's one more surprising quality I want to point out that we know about these 12 men. Not only did Jesus call the unlikely, but here's our second last point today, number 2. Jesus called the unlikable. Look again at the list, verses 14 to 16. Simon, who he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. There are 2 guys on this list who we can almost guarantee had a very difficult time being in the same room. First, there's Matthew, also known as Levi, who we've already seen in Luke's gospel was a tax collector. And we talked a lot about why tax collectors were despised by the Jewish people. They worked for Rome, the bad guys. They were sellouts, traitors, part of the elite. And they gave God's money to the emperor while padding their own pockets along the way. Then on the other side, we see another guy named Simon. And we're told that he was called the Zealot. What does that mean? Well, the Zealots were a political group that sought to overthrow Roman rule. They wanted to restore Israel's national identity, and they often resorted to violence in their attempts. In other words, these guys were hardcore. They hated Rome, and especially those Jewish people who sold out to Rome. So with that in mind, what do you think Simon the Zealot thought of Matthew the tax collector? What do you think went through their minds when they both heard their names called out? What do you think those conversations were like? Do you think their past professions might have caused a little bit of friction? These guys were polar opposites on the political spectrum. In Jewish society, they were sworn enemies. And yet we don't see a single instance in the Gospels where they were divided. We know the disciples argued on occasion, but we don't see them fighting over their political strategies or geopolitical issues. Some way, somehow, it seems that Jesus was able to take the unlikable and teach them to work together. And again, it wasn't because that's all he had to work with. Jesus chose this. He wanted this. He wanted 2 guys who were enemies in the world's eyes to become brothers. Why? Why did Jesus call Matthew the tax collector and Simon the Zealot? Because Jesus wanted us to see that unity does not come from sameness, but it comes from him. Jesus takes people from all walks of life and unites them around himself and his mission. And these 2 polar opposite guys give us a beautiful picture of the power of the church. 12 apostles, they were the first church, and out of their ministries came the church as we know it today. And just as it was with them, in every local church, including ours, there are people so different that they would be in any other circumstance unlikable. People from different parts of the country and different parts of the world. Different economic levels and different political leanings. People raised in church and people raised to hate church. Loud people and quiet people. Rich people and poor people. Athletic people and musical people. I got to tell y'all, I didn't mean it like that. But in the first service, Jeremy was sitting in the back when I said that line, and he just busted out belly laughing. It was not an insult, Jeremy. You can be both, okay? Maybe. My point is, just about every difference between human beings you can think of can be found in our church. We have some people in here who would ordinarily never be in the same room if it weren't for Jesus. And that's what makes the church special. What gives us a unique testimony in our culture. I'm sure people saw Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot traveling together, hanging out, and they thought, what in the world? What could be so powerful that these guys could work together and even love one another? There's only one answer, and it's Jesus. So if there are some people in our church you think you have nothing in common with, you look around and you say, there's nobody here like me. If there are some people here who get on your nerves, who think so differently than you, if there are some people here who you would not want to be stuck on a long car ride with, that's great. That means you're in the right place. That means you're setting aside worldly differences to be united around Christ. And that's the testimony of the church. Jesus calls the unlikely and the unlikable. But there's actually one more name on this list that jumps out at us. It's the elephant in the room, right? That's Judas. Luke tells us right from the jump, Judas became a traitor. The question we might ask is, did Jesus know Judas would betray him? When Jesus picked Judas, did he realize that guy would play a role in his crucifixion? Yes. Jesus knew. And yet he not only picked Judas to be a part of the 12, but he also spent 3 years with him. He allowed him to oversee the ministry's money. He invested his time and energy into him, knowing good and well it would be wasted. And there's so much to think about there, it'll make your head hurt. Because obviously we know it was God's plan for Judas to betray Jesus, and yet Judas clearly chose to betray Jesus. We will never fully understand that mystery. But I simply want to close with this point, which I think is a warning. Judas shows us that you can be so close to Jesus. You can know about him. You can hear his teaching. You can see his power firsthand, and yet still completely miss him. Judas chose money over Jesus. And it's clear that as soon as the betrayal was over, he regretted so deeply what he gave up that he took his own life. Don't miss Jesus. Don't choose something else over him. He loves you. He died for you, and he wants to use you. Yes, you, to make a difference for his kingdom. No matter who you are or where you've been, Jesus can use you if you'll just come to him and surrender all. Would you bow with me in prayer?